The purpose of this lesson is to review the roles of the timer, the starter, and the start clock in theory and common practice. According to the USSA Alpine competition regulations, fixed start intervals are mandated for all disciplines other than slalom. In the higher speed races, a veritable army of people at the start, including the starter, the start referee, and the start recorder, are tasked with ensuring that racers push out of the start gate at the interval designated by the jury. Technically, it's only in slalom that the timer orally prompts the starter when to start each racer. A fixed interval is mandated in downhill Super G and GS for a number of reasons. The primary reason is that it helps keep appropriate spacing of competitors on the course. Not only does that reduce the risk of a high-speed overtake or collision, it also provides predictable windows for course workers, officials, and the competitors themselves. Start intervals are also referenced by the jury when establishing yellow zones. Finally, a fixed interval facilitates an efficient race, which is important when you need to get 200 or more racers through 2 runs in a day. Irregular start intervals are necessary in slalom due to the higher degree of unpredictability regarding coursework, for example, the replacement of broken gates, as well as hiking racers. In the case of fixed start intervals, there's supposed to be a visible clock at the start that has an audible start signal. The starter is supposed to use that synchronized clock to determine when to start the next competitor. In other words, in downhill, Super G, and GS, the starter is not supposed to rely on start prompts from the timer over the headset. That's contrary to most of the verbal cadences in this lesson set. I'll explain the common reasons for the deviation in a bit. Here's how fixed interval starts are supposed to work. In the case of a standard 60-second interval, the starter, again without prompting from the timer, will say 10 seconds when the second hand reaches the numeral 10 on the clock face. The starter will begin the 5-second countdown when the second hand reaches 11, and the starter will say go when the second hand reaches 12. The racer has a valid start if she starts when the second hand is between 11 and 1. The start recorder is responsible for writing down each racer's actual start time, and the start referee is tasked with determining whether each start is valid. Although a 60-second interval is the default, and blessedly simple, it's not that common in the context of lower-level USSA and FIS races, where the courses accommodate shorter intervals. The start window concept is the same, however. Let's look at the case of a 45-second interval. The first interval is when the second hand reaches 12 on the clock face, and a valid start is any time within 5 seconds of that moment. The second interval would be 45 seconds later, when the second hand reaches the 9 on the clock face. The third interval is when the second hand reaches 6. The fourth interval is when the second hand reaches the 3, and the cycle repeats at the fifth interval. Similar patterns exist for any other interval as determined by the jury within the limits prescribed by the rules. So why is it that I've created audio tracks for the Learn Split-Second software series in which the timer is calling out starts for GS and Super G races, contrary to the rules? Well, the practice is not that uncommon, particularly for lower-level races at smaller ski hills. I can think of at least 2 reasons why the use of a start clock isn't universal. First of all, real start clocks are expensive. For instance, the TAG HL930 pictured above, a very nice piece of equipment that incorporates a GPS system that automatically sets the clock to the correct time of day, costs a cool $3,600. Second, many clubs don't have a surplus of experienced starters and start referees. Learning how to use a start clock correctly isn't rocket science, but it does represent an incremental barrier to adequately staffing a ski race. Nevertheless, the extra cost and added complexity of a real start clock is worth the investment. For higher speed events, consistent start intervals and spacing on the course matters. Having predictable start intervals controlled by a start clock gives the jury more direct control over the race. For example, the TD can call for a 2-interval course hold, and everybody knows what that really means. Furthermore, the use of a start clock relieves the burden of trying to maintain good intervals off the shoulders of the timer, who typically has plenty to do already.